years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, global attention is once again turning to the war. Washington has been trying to push an accelerated ceasefire as Russian missiles and drones continue to rain down on Ukraine territory. But the attacks aren't just coming from the air and on land. They are also happening in our digital information sphere. Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. One of the first places that showcased the threat of Russian influence operations was Ukraine, both before and during the first invasion in 2014. Since then, it's become a frontline not just for conventional war, but for combat that relies heavily on weaponized information. The messaging coming from Russia is specifically targeted at citizens of strategic third countries to change their attitudes towards Ukraine, and politicians make decisions based on public opinion. Our first guest is a true European at heart. He was the president of the European Parliament during the bloc's Great Enlargement, often called the Big Bang, and he is now supporting Ukraine on its path to joining the EU. What is the political situation now in Ukraine after one round of Trump's peace talks? Will the country hold an election before the end of the war? And who could be the next president of Ukraine? We'll talk about that and more with Pat Cox.
Pat Cox, president of the Jean Monnet Foundation for Europe. He is a distinguished Irish politician and economist with a career spanning academia, journalism, and European politics. He served as president of the European Parliament and previously represented Munster as an MEP. He now leads parliamentary reform initiatives in Ukraine. Pat Cox chairs sustainably focused companies like Gore Street Energy Storage Fund and Ecosem, and holds numerous honors, including the Charlemagne Prize and national awards from several countries.
Pat, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us straight from Ireland, Dublin. We are talking today about Ukraine and the situation that is happening in there, also in terms of the US administration targeting Ukraine as one of the first angles. So you're often in Ukraine. What is different right now since the president has changed in US?
I think the change has been extraordinary. I think the alignment of the United States has shifted closer to Russia, to Putin and the Russian narrative of the war, and has shifted away from, in a very significant way, from the previous administration. We saw the most public manifestation of that in the General Assembly vote on the third anniversary of the war of aggression on the 24th of February, when the United States aligned itself with Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in voting against a European-inspired resolution that called out the truth that Russia is the aggressor state. That high-profile diplomatic signal, to my mind, tells everything. And all that has followed in terms of first calling Putin, sending negotiators directly to Moscow, preparing the way for what's about to happen in negotiations, shows a considerable realignment, one that I think must create a lot of anxiety for Ukraine, and I think creates enormous anxiety for the wider European continent.
And Russian disinformation is heavily involved also in Ukraine and in other Western European countries especially. Do you see that also it affects the Ukrainian citizens? You are often guest in Ukraine these days.
I certainly think that Ukraine, perhaps more than most of us, is well aware of the power of Russian disinformation. In fact, I would say that particularly in the post-negotiation period, whatever emerges from that, and if and when Ukraine begins the next phase of its survival battle, which is the establishment of a pluralist post-war democracy, I think we can expect, under the Gerasimov doctrine that we know so well, the continuation of Russia's war in a hybrid form. Do not be surprised to have massive disinformation, potential cyber attacks, to have GRU and FSB dirty money interfering, to have false flag security operations, and a whole series of black operations of that sort. I think that can be predicted, and therefore, if we can predict it, we must seek to expose it transparently and minimize it. And of course, we also now have transatlantically a new mindset. We've seen the extraordinary support by Elon Musk of the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. We've witnessed the willingness of what I would call bad actors to do with national sovereignty and democracy, seeking to interfere with election processes. So I think all of this makes the coming period particularly difficult to navigate, and we need to be conscious of the capacity and willingness of various actors, many of them bad actors, to seek to manipulate and interfere with the emergence of a stable, pluralist, post-war democracy in Ukraine.
And it's also important for the European security. And as you said, a lot of those things could have been predicted and were predicted, but do you think that what exactly US is doing right now on pushing, for example, Ukraine into the early or during presidential elections during the war is something that is also building on the destabilization of the country?
I think Ukraine is being pushed very heavily on a number of fronts. They were told that they have no cards. They have the card of moral integrity. They have the card of victimhood in the face of aggression. They have the card of substantial and determined European support. They have the card of their willingness to seek to maintain and defend their sovereignty and their democracy. And these are important cards that cannot be reduced to nothing or to nil in terms of what counts. And I think in respect of the pressure on Ukraine, the appropriation of resources, the so-called minerals deal, the potential appropriation of energy resources such as Zaporizhzhia and so on, I'm appalled by it, but there it is. It's a fact of life. And Ukraine has to deal with this, as do others. But in the end of the day, I think forcing premature elections on a system whose electoral foundations are not yet in place would be quite disgraceful and counterproductive. All of the political factions in Ukraine have agreed as far back as November of 2023, so long before US elections for the presidency, that there should be an interregnum or a period of up to 6 months after the end of martial law and before the holding of an election, in order that the Central Election Commission, instructed by the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament in Kiev, would go about establishing electoral registers of the externally displaced, election registers of the even larger number of internally displaced, the renovation and provision of polling places, many of which were destroyed, the issues around the inclusion, the full inclusion of veterans and the military, and many other specific technical challenges that are unprecedented for Ukraine and that will require to be worked on to have a foundation that says as much as could be done in as fair a way as possible has been done to prepare open, pluralist, free elections. And this will be the bedrock upon which the post-war integrity of Ukraine will be founded and will depend.
And that's about strengthening the democracy in Ukraine, but also democracy has its challenges, as influence operations and disinformation are being one of those. Do you see that there are some pushes for a particular candidate coming from Russia, perhaps?
Look, there's a long record of interference. Mr. Putin was not very long in his job, a quarter of a century ago, when he impressed upon the then President Kuchma to appoint Viktor Yanukovych as Prime Minister in 2003. The Kremlin directly campaigned for Yanukovych in the elections of 2004, which were so corrupt it led to the Orange Revolution and the holding again of those elections where President Yushchenko won. Putin then weaponized energy, charged Ukraine phenomenal prices per cubic meter, even more than they charged the much richer Federal Republic of Germany. And the effect of that was to create an electoral space that yielded the presidency to Yanukovych in 2010. And then, of course, he did the deal on 40 years of Black Sea Fleet presence in Sebastopol in Crimea, which saw a reduction in the energy price. So Putin has a long record from the very beginning of his first presidential mandate of interfering, and we can expect that to continue. But the fact that he wishes to do it is in itself another oppressive dimension on the way the Kremlin treats Ukraine, in a sense, as a non-existent entity to do with statehood. And this has to be rejected. Under the UN Charter, Ukraine, in its most fundamental right, has a right to its territorial integrity, its sovereignty and democracy.
And Ukraine is not only about security, but it's also a big part of business. And looking at what US right now is pushing for, can you see as well that rebuilding Ukraine and the national resources that US is also asking for is one of the key reasons why Ukraine is actually starting to be the central focus point of the US administration?
Well, it seems that the United States' appetite for resource acquisition has no boundary. We see the focus on Canada, the focus on Greenland, and the focus on minerals and energy to date in Ukraine. I think it's extremely important from Ukraine's own point of view that any funding that is available through multilateral financial agencies, international financial institutions, or bilateral aid from states should offer Ukraine the reasonable chance through a tendering process of getting value for money in respect of their national project for reconstruction. And of course, we still have the thorny and divided issue on whether anything will happen with the frozen central bank assets of the Russian central bank held primarily by European agencies. All of these things still need to be fully trashed out. But the idea that someone should put their thumb on the scale and say, all of this is for us and this is payback for deluded and exaggerated figures on what was invested or given to Ukraine during the war should not be allowed to prevail. And this is an area where the European Union and European states, including Great Britain, are greatly challenged and will need to assert their presence and to find their voice and to do it for Ukraine, because doing it for Ukraine is ultimately a protection of doing it for the Baltic states, for Poland, and for the rest of the European continent.
And I think that's the best end of our conversation. We need to stick together and support Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.
As ceasefire talks begin, some US officials are finding themselves inadvertently repeating Russia's twisted arguments. Moscow has been particularly keen to distort the truth about President Zelenskyy and his term in office. Here's a breakdown of the manipulation surrounding this issue.
Russian propaganda portrays Zelenskyy, first of all, as the leader of the country which does not exist. And Zelenskyy is a leader of this nation, so he is not legitimate enough for Putin and for the Kremlin. This line that of so-called illegitimacy of Zelenskyy is constantly present in Russian propaganda and Russian narratives. Second thing about Zelenskyy in Russian propaganda is that they portray him as a corrupt politician, and generally that Ukraine is totally corrupt country, that corruption is incurable in Ukraine, that you can't deal with the country, you can't trust Ukraine. It's kind of also a message to Western partners of Ukraine that your military aid has been stolen. by Ukrainians, so on and so forth. It's not true because Ukraine has been fighting corruption since the Revolution of Dignity very actively. And we have to credit Zelenskyy here because he kind of tamed down the influence of Ukrainian oligarchs. Zelenskyy for this, he even put behind the bars Yehor Brailian, the most notorious probably of oligarchs. Another thing is Russian propaganda also portrayed Zelenskyy as kind of neo-Nazi, and the whole Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian authorities are portrayed as a Nazi regime. It's absolutely ridiculous. Zelenskyy, he's Ukrainian of Jewish origin. He's part of his family during World War II was killed in the Holocaust in the Babi Yar ravine in Kyiv by the Nazis. His family suffered during the Holocaust. And to portray Ukrainian Jewish person as a Nazi is absurd. Russian propaganda question the legitimacy of Zelenskyy. Soon there will be 6 years when he is in power in Ukraine. But the thing is that according to Ukrainian constitution, you can't hold elections during martial law. Putin portrayed Ukraine for a long time, for many years, as country which is run by Americans, that there is no Ukrainian authorities. Now Putin suggests himself this idea of external management for Ukraine. I just find it very, very funny.
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion. We gave you military equipment, and you men are brave.
The Russian influence operations targeting Ukraine and other countries take various forms, but their ultimate goal is always the same. My next guest joins us to talk about how disinformation is shifting the security landscape in Europe and around the world.
Dr. Yehor Brailian, historian and journalist. He's an associate professor at the Kyiv Aviation Institute, specializing in international relations and strategic studies. He holds an MA in history from Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University and is a postgraduate member of the Royal Historical Society. Dr. Brailian is currently an analyst at Detector Media, where he examines Russian disinformation and hybrid warfare. He is actively involved in international forums on security and media, with a research focus on Ukrainian-British relations and global propaganda dynamics. As a journalist, he has contributed to prominent outlets such as the BBC, Radio Free Europe, and the Wilson Center, focusing on international relations and information security.
Yehor, thank you so much for joining us today, straight from Kiev. You are at the heart of what is right now at the words of pretty much everyone in the world, and you are dealing with researching influence operations and disinformation. And do you see that there is a change of influence operations currently happening in Ukraine?
Yes, hello, thanks for having me. Good afternoon. Well, first of all, I would like to say that Russia is continuing its work with the manipulation of public opinion inside Ukraine. People are really tired, and people are tired of daily attacks. I'm talking not only about Kyiv, but also other Ukrainian cities.
And you also do a research of the Russian operations in the other countries. Do you see any similarities? And what are the techniques, procedures that they use in Ukraine and other Western countries?
Russia is monitoring very closely different NATO countries. It dates back to Soviet times when they were monitoring public opinion inside NATO, and we still have it today. When we are talking about, for example, Poland, Russia is manipulating history, especially history of the 20th century, of the Second World War, and Russia wants to have this.
And what specifically they are targeting into the Second World War?
Especially Stepan Bandera, his personality, and Ukrainian-Polish relations throughout the first half of the 20th century. Yes, they were not very easy. It was a very complicated period in our bilateral relations of our nations. But anyway, Russia wants to say that Ukrainians are bad people, and it's about different aspects, like it's not only about Ukrainians in the past, but also Ukrainians in the present. I'm talking about Ukrainian refugees who came to Poland after February 2022. And at Detector Media, we were analyzing this Lublin Triangle perspective. And for Russia, Lublin Triangle is a clear example of hostile alliance. But for us in Ukraine, Lublin Triangle is a very important alliance of strengthening regional security, and it's also about reviving our historical memory about our common past in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And I would say that despite of that fact that Telegram is not so popular in Poland than in Ukraine, but anyway, Russia is using different social media, for example, Facebook, to make Poles angry towards Ukrainians.
I would like to ask you as well about other countries, because that's a pattern that Russia is using, and one is destabilizing and polarizing various countries, but also in terms of needed support right now for Ukraine, it's targeting citizens in different countries to change the attitudes of those citizens towards the Ukraine. You described situation in Poland. What you're seeing in Romania, for example, or perhaps some other countries that you've been doing research on?
I was writing several texts about Great Britain, the United States of America, and in these countries, for example, in Britain, Russia wants to say like why you need to support Ukraine, because you have a lot of problems inside your country. For example, illegal migration. And let's not forget about the protests that were in Britain last summer, and they were caused by anonymous groups in WhatsApp and on Telegram. And what we have right now in the United States, it's a result of work of Russian, Soviet and Russian intelligence to crack the American society and American democracy.
Thank you so much for describing the situation in different countries. The goal of disinformation is exactly the same, but the use of different tactics, techniques and procedures is a bit different. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much.
Now, let's see how Russia uses fabricated evidence to sow disinformation about Ukraine.
Fabricated evidence is a key disinformation strategy used by Russia to distort perceptions of the war in Ukraine. This involves creating fake videos, doctored images, and false reports to accuse Ukraine of war crimes, justify Russian aggression, or portray Ukrainians as extremists. Examples of disinformation campaigns involving fabricated evidence, including staged events or manipulated footage to falsely claim attacks on civilians by Ukrainian forces. These fabrications are often amplified through state-controlled media and social platforms to spread disinformation globally.
As the Republican US President Ronald Reagan once said, peace is not absence of conflict. It is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. There is no doubt that peace is urgently needed in Ukraine, but reaching that goal must begin with understanding the conflict. And with Russian influence operations as powerful as they are right now, Ukrainian democracy needs to be stronger than ever. The latest data shows that only 15% of Ukrainians support an election before the end of the war. But the country and its citizens are being pushed to elect a new leader using a variety of tactics. And we are being pressured to go along with it. So till next time, keep calm and think deeply.